Welcome to Dead Air Confessions. Late at night, when the streets are empty and the signal begins to fade, people start sharing the things they never say out loud. The strange call they received, the person they saw standing outside, the night they realized they were not alone. Tonight, you will hear stories from people who carried those memories for years. Before we go on air, leave a comment and tell me where you are listening from tonight. And if you enjoy true scary stories with a quiet, late-night feel, subscribe to Dead Air Confessions. Turn the volume down low. The line is open.
The strongest detail is the timing. The morning after helping remove your father's body, a completely unfamiliar black goat was standing at the doorstep of an isolated ranch where no one had ever seen one before. I'm keeping the grief, your younger brother watching cartoons, the family's numb reaction, and the uncertainty between a wandering animal, coincidence, and something that felt like an omen at the center. My father died in my parents' house after a long battle with cancer. Even though we knew he was seriously ill, knowing that death is coming does not prepare you for the moment it actually arrives. There is a difference between understanding something in theory and being forced to stand inside it. I remember getting the phone call from my mother. She was panicking. Her voice made it clear before I fully understood the words that something terrible had happened. I had to go over to the house immediately. The drive there felt unreal. My thoughts moved too quickly and not quickly enough at the same time. I knew my father had been sick. I knew this day was possible. But part of me still expected to arrive and find that there had been a misunderstanding, that he was still alive, or that someone else would take control of the situation. Instead, I reached the house and found my family trying to exist in the middle of something none of us knew how to handle. My younger brother was only 10 years old. He was sitting in the living room watching cartoons. That image has stayed with me almost as strongly as anything else from that day. The television continued showing bright colors and animated characters, while our father lay dead elsewhere in the house. My brother may not have understood everything that was happening. Perhaps the cartoons were the only familiar thing he could hold on to. Maybe the adults had left them on, because nobody knew what else to do with him. The normal sound from the television made the situation feel even more unreal. A child was sitting on the couch. Cartoons were playing. My mother was devastated. My father had died. All of those things existed in the same house at the same time. There were practical things that had to be done, even though none of us were emotionally prepared to do them. Someone had to make calls. Someone had to speak clearly enough to give the address and explain what had happened. Someone had to contact the funeral home. I ended up helping. When the people from the funeral home arrived, I also helped them lift and transport my father's body. That part was deeply traumatic. The body was still my father, but it was also no longer him in the way I had always known him. I had spent my life seeing him move, speak, react, and occupy space with his own presence. Now other people were carefully lifting him, adjusting him, and carrying him out of the house. There is something final about watching a body leave a home. Before that moment, death can still feel contained inside one room. Once the body is taken through the door, the entire house seems to change. I helped because it needed to be done. I do not remember feeling strong or brave. I was operating on instinct and obligation. There was no time to process what I was seeing. I had to support the weight, move where I was told, and make sure everything happened respectfully. Afterward, the house felt hollow. My father was gone. The room where he had died still existed. His belongings remained where they had been, but the person who connected all of those things was no longer there. The day passed in a blur of grief, exhaustion, phone calls, and silence. I thought that was the worst part. Then, the next morning happened. My parents lived on a large ranch of more than 100 acres. The property was isolated. The driveway alone stretched for more than half a mile from the road to the house. You could not casually wander onto the property without traveling a significant distance. The house was not in a neighborhood where animals regularly escaped from nearby yards and appeared on porches. It stood in the middle of open land, far from the normal movement of town streets. My family had lived there for more than 20 years. I had personally spent 13 years of my life on that property. We knew the land. We knew the neighboring families. We knew what kinds of animals people kept nearby. We knew the wildlife that occasionally crossed the fields. There were ordinary surprises on a ranch. Deer appeared. Coyotes moved through at a distance. Birds, snakes, insects, and other animals found their way near the house. But nobody around us owned goats. That is important. We knew the neighbors well enough that an escaped farm animal would normally have an obvious source. The next morning, I drove back to the house. I do not remember exactly why I was returning. There were probably more arrangements to make, more people to speak with, and more practical tasks surrounding my father's death. Grief does not allow a family to stop functioning. There are documents, calls, visitors, and decisions. I drove down the long driveway toward the house. The property looked the same as it always had, but it no longer felt the same. I parked and got out of the car. Then I stopped. There was a black goat standing on the doorstep. Not near the house, not somewhere in the field, directly at the entrance. It was completely black, or close enough that this is how I remember it. Its coat was dark, its body solid and still against the house. Years later, when the film The Witch came out, the goat in that movie reminded me immediately of the animal I had seen. This happened several years before that film, so the movie did not create the memory. It only gave me a familiar visual reference. The goat looked almost identical. It stood there as though it belonged at the door. That was what disturbed me. A loose animal wandering onto the ranch would be strange enough, but I would expect it to be grazing, moving through the yard, eating plants, or exploring. This goat was positioned at the threshold. It looked as though it had arrived at the house specifically. I stood near my car, staring at it. The day before, I had helped carry my father's body out through that home. Now, the next morning, a black goat was standing where people entered and left. The timing felt too deliberate. I knew there had to be an ordinary explanation. Goats are animals. They escape. People transport them. They wander. But the rational part of my mind was competing with everything I had experienced during the previous 24 hours. I was exhausted and grieving. My sense of reality had already been damaged by death. The goat seemed less like a random animal and more like something connected to what had happened inside. I walked toward the house. The animal did not attack me or behave aggressively. It allowed me to pass. I went inside and asked whether anyone knew why there was a black goat standing on the doorstep. My language was probably less calm than that. I could not understand why nobody else seemed alarmed. My mother looked outside. She was emotionally destroyed after losing her husband. In her condition, the goat did not seem capable of adding much more to what she was already carrying. She looked at it and more or less shrugged. Her reaction was not that the animal was normal. It was closer to having no emotional energy left to respond. My father had just died. A strange goat on the doorstep could not compete with that. Other people in the house reacted similarly. Nobody had an explanation. Nobody recognized it as belonging to a neighbor. Nobody seemed interested in calling around immediately or trying to catch it. They acknowledged that it was strange, but they did not treat it as important. A few minutes later, I went back outside. The goat was gone. I did not see it walking down the driveway. I did not see it crossing a field. It had simply left while we were inside. I searched the immediate area with my eyes, but there was no sign of it. The property was large, so an animal could disappear behind the house, into brush, or across uneven land fairly quickly. There was nothing physically impossible about it being gone. Still, I expected to see something. A black goat standing at the entrance should remain visible for at least a while in open ranch country. But I never saw it again. No neighbor contacted us to ask whether we had found a missing animal. No one came looking for a goat. We never heard a story about one escaping from a trailer or farm. There was no explanation afterward. The animal appeared the morning after my father's death and then vanished from our lives. What made it stranger was the family's reaction over time. No one talked about it. I was the person who kept bringing it up. Whenever I mentioned the black goat, the others responded with the same emotional distance. They would say something like, "Oh yeah, that was strange, I guess." Then the conversation would move on. They did not deny seeing it. They did not tell me grief had caused me to imagine it. The goat was real enough that other people remembered it. They simply did not give it the same importance I did. That difference in reaction made me question myself. Why was I the only person who found the timing deeply unsettling? Perhaps everyone else was too overwhelmed by my father's death to attach meaning to an animal. Maybe they had placed the goat in a category of minor problems that did not matter during a family tragedy. A strange animal appeared. Then it left. Compared with losing a husband or father, that was nothing. For me, however, the goat became attached to the death immediately. The two memories were separated by only one night. First, I helped carry my father's body from the house. Then I returned and found a black animal waiting at the entrance. It felt symbolic, even though I did not want it to. Black goats carry a great deal of cultural meaning. They appear in stories, religion, folklore, horror, and old superstitions. They are sometimes associated with sacrifice, wilderness, death, evil, or something standing outside normal human life. I already knew at least some of those associations, even before modern films made the image more familiar. A white goat wandering onto the porch might have seemed odd. A small brown goat might have looked almost funny. A black goat standing silently on the doorstep the morning after a death felt like an omen. I do not believe an animal's color makes it evil. A black goat is simply a goat with dark fur. But human beings do not react only to facts. We react to timing, setting, and imagery. The same animal in a petting zoo would mean nothing. On an isolated doorstep after a death, it becomes difficult not to see a message. The most likely explanation is that the goat escaped from somewhere. Even though none of the neighbors we knew owned goats, the animal could have come from farther away. Rural areas contain properties that are not always visible from the main road. Someone may have recently bought goats without telling anyone. A small farm could exist beyond the neighbors we knew. The animal might have traveled several miles. Goats are capable of crossing rough land, squeezing through fences, and wandering farther than people expect. It may have followed a road, fence line, creek, or trail until it reached our house. The long driveway would not stop an animal. To a goat, it was simply another path. Someone could also have been transporting livestock nearby. A trailer door might have opened. The animal could have escaped during loading or unloading and wandered onto the ranch. The owner may never have known exactly where it went. Perhaps they searched in another direction. If the goat had no identifying collar or tag, we would have no way to trace it. There is also a chance it had been abandoned. People sometimes leave unwanted animals on rural land because they assume a ranch owner will take care of them. Someone may have driven partway down the driveway during the night, released the goat, and left. The animal then walked to the house because it associated buildings with food or people. By morning, it was standing at the door. When nobody fed it, it moved on. That explanation would fit the location better than a random long-distance wander. But we did not hear a vehicle, and there was no evidence anyone had entered the property. The goat might have been attracted to something near the doorway. There could have been plants, salt, spilled food, or a familiar smell. Goats are curious animals. They climb, explore, and approach structures. The doorstep may have offered shelter from wind or a raised, dry surface. If the house was warmer than the surrounding air, the animal could have stood close to it overnight. Its position at the entrance may have looked intentional only because humans naturally interpret doors as meaningful. To the goat, it may have been the most comfortable patch of ground. Its disappearance is also easy to explain. While I was inside, it walked around the house or moved into the fields. The ranch covered more than 100 acres. An animal could vanish from sight within minutes, especially if there were trees, hills, barns, fences, or brush nearby. The fact that I did not see it again does not mean it disappeared unnaturally. It may have continued traveling and been found by someone else later. A predator could have killed it. It might have joined other animals on a distant property. There are countless ordinary endings we would never hear about. The failure of neighbors to report a missing goat also proves very little. We knew the nearby residents, but we did not know every person within the distance an animal could travel. The owner may have assumed it was lost permanently. They could have found it later without realizing it had visited us. The animal may not have belonged to a private owner at all. Feral or abandoned goats can survive in rural areas longer than people expect. The timing, then, would be a coincidence. My father died. A goat wandered onto the property the next morning. Because grief had made me emotionally vulnerable, I connected them. Coincidence can feel insulting during trauma. An event with enormous personal meaning is followed by something visually powerful, and the mind insists the two must belong together. But the natural world does not arrange itself around human loss. Animals move without knowing who died inside a house. The goat may have been traveling before my father passed. It could have arrived if he were alive, if nobody were home, or if it were any other ordinary morning. We remember the coincidence because of its timing. If the animal had appeared 6 months earlier, it would have become a strange family story and nothing more. Grief also changes perception. After someone dies, the world feels charged with messages. A song on the radio seems chosen. A bird at the window feels like a visitor. A light flickers at exactly the right moment. A familiar smell appears in an empty room. These things may have occurred many times before, but loss makes us notice them differently. The mind searches for continuation because the sudden absence of a person is almost impossible to accept. I may have been prepared to see meaning in anything unusual that morning. The black goat was simply a powerful object for that need to attach itself to. There is also the possibility that I remember the animal as darker and more dramatic than it actually was. It may have been dark brown with lighter patches. The horns, posture, and size may have become more like the goat from The Witch after I saw that film years later. The movie gave the memory a polished image. Now, when I think of the animal, I may partly see the film version. This does not mean there was no goat. Other people remembered it. But memory is reconstructive. Each later reference can influence earlier details. The real goat may have looked less perfect, less still, and less ominous than the image I now carry. Perhaps it moved around the porch, chewed something, or made noise. Over time, those ordinary behaviors disappeared from the memory. What remained was the black shape waiting silently at the door. The film did not create the event, but it may have sharpened its symbolism. My family's lack of interest may support this. They saw an ordinary stray goat during a terrible week. I saw an almost supernatural figure. The difference may come from how memory developed afterward. They did not revisit the moment repeatedly, so it remained small. I thought about it for years, connecting it to folklore, horror images, and the date of my father's death. The more I revisited it, the more it became a scene. Another possibility is that the goat belonged to someone who had come to the house because of the death. Rural communities sometimes include people with unusual vehicles, animals, or work routines. A visitor may have tied or left the goat near the entrance temporarily. Perhaps someone stopped to offer condolences, deliver food, or speak with my mother. The animal wandered from their truck or trailer. By the time I went inside, the person had collected it, but nobody remembered a visitor arriving with a goat. A person would likely mention the animal or apologize for it being loose. The goat appeared alone. It left without any visible human involvement. A prank is possible, though it would be cruel and strangely specific. Someone could have known my father had died and placed a black goat on the doorstep to frighten the family. But that would require access to the animal, knowledge of the timing, and a reason to target grieving people. We had no known enemies who would do something like that. The goat was not tied there or marked with a message. It was free to move. A prank creates more questions than it answers. The supernatural explanation is that the goat was an omen or messenger connected to my father's death. Perhaps it arrived to mark the passage from life to death. Maybe it represented something waiting outside the house after my father's spirit had left. Its position at the threshold would then matter. The doorstep separates inside from outside, family from wilderness, safety from the unknown. The previous day, my father's body had crossed that threshold for the last time. The next morning, the black goat stood in the same place. Some people might interpret it as a guardian. Others would see it as something darker. A black goat has been associated in various traditions with death, evil, sacrifice, and the devil. If a person already believed in those symbols, the sight would feel unmistakably threatening. It could appear as though something had come to claim the space after a death. But symbols do not prove supernatural causes. They exist in human culture, not necessarily in the intentions of animals. The goat did not act threateningly. It did not enter the house. It did not charge, bite, or follow anyone. It allowed me to walk past. Then it left. Its behavior was neutral. The darkness came from what I associated with it, not from anything it did. My grandmother or another relative might have called it a sign of protection rather than evil. Someone else might say it represented resilience, stubbornness, or survival. The meaning depends on the observer. That makes symbolism emotionally powerful, but unreliable as evidence. Another spiritual interpretation is that the goat was somehow connected to my father personally. Maybe he had liked animals, worked the land, or spent years on the ranch. The goat could have appeared as one final strange event tied to the place he called home. I do not know whether my father had any specific connection to goats. If he did not, then the animal becomes a general symbol rather than a personal one. A meaningful sign usually feels more convincing when it includes something unique to the deceased, a favorite song, object, phrase, or animal. The black goat was powerful, but not necessarily personal. It may have reflected my emotional state more than my father's identity. The event can also be understood through the contrast between life and death. The previous day, I had handled a body that no longer moved. The next morning, an unfamiliar living animal stood outside. It was breathing, watching, and capable of walking away. Perhaps that contrast is part of why I remember it so strongly. Death had made the world feel still. The goat was alive, but silent. It occupied the doorway like a replacement presence. Then it disappeared before anyone could decide what to do with it. The animal's silence matched the family's emotional state. Nobody wanted to explain anything. My mother looked out and shrugged. Other relatives noticed and moved on. We were all functioning through shock. The goat may have become a symbol of everything we did not have the strength to process. Even now, I am struck by how casually everyone else remembers it. They agree it happened. They agree it was unusual. But they refuse, consciously or not, to give it significance. Perhaps that was their way of protecting themselves. There was already too much meaning in the house. Every chair, room, medicine bottle, and sound was connected to my father. They did not need one more mystery. The goat was easier to dismiss than to absorb. My reaction may have been different because I needed somewhere to place the intensity of what I had experienced. The phone call, my brother's cartoons, the funeral home, and the weight of my father's body were too painful to understand directly. The goat offered a safer kind of fear. It was strange rather than purely tragic. I could ask where it came from and what it meant. Those questions were easier than asking how my father could be gone. That does not make the event imaginary. It only explains why it may have occupied so much of my attention. Trauma chooses unusual details. A person may remember a lamp, a smell, the color of a wall, or an animal outside more clearly than entire conversations. The mind attaches to something concrete when the larger event is too overwhelming. For me, that concrete image was a black goat on the doorstep. The most likely explanation is ordinary. A goat escaped or was abandoned somewhere within traveling distance. It followed the driveway or crossed the fields. The house attracted it because of shelter, food, curiosity, or human scent. It stood near the entrance for a while and wandered away when nobody interacted with it. No owner found us, and we never learned where it came from. The coincidence with my father's death gave the appearance more meaning than it otherwise would have carried. That is the answer I believe is most reasonable. But reason does not remove the timing. My family had lived on that land for more than 20 years. I had lived there for 13. We had never seen a stray goat on the property. None of the neighbors we knew kept them. Then, my father died inside the house. I helped the funeral workers lift him and carry him through the doorway. The next morning, I drove half a mile down an isolated driveway, stepped out of my car, and found a black goat standing at that same entrance. It waited while I approached. It let me pass. My mother looked at it through the window and had no reaction left to give. A few minutes later, it was gone. No one ever claimed it. No one ever explained it. No one in my family seems to think it matters. Maybe it does not. Maybe a lost animal happened to choose the worst possible morning to wander onto our porch. But whenever I think about the days surrounding my father's death, the goat is there. My younger brother is still watching cartoons while the adults make calls. My mother is still panicking on the phone. I am still helping strangers lift my father's body. Then, morning comes. The ranch is silent. The driveway stretches back toward the road. And on the doorstep, in the middle of more than 100 acres, where no goat had ever appeared before, a black animal stands waiting as though it has arrived to acknowledge that someone has left. Our house has an attic, and the only way to reach it is through my stepsister's old bedroom. She does not live with us anymore, so the room is mostly used for storage now. Boxes, decorations, and things nobody needs every day tend to end up there. It is not a room people spend much time in. The attic entrance is not directly inside the bedroom. There are two doors. The first door opens from the bedroom into a small, enclosed space. It is large enough for several people to stand inside at once. Beyond that small area is another door, and behind the second door are the stairs leading up into the attic. One day, my mother asked my biological sister, who was 18 at the time, to carry some decorations upstairs. It was an ordinary request. My sister took the decorations into the old bedroom and went toward the attic entrance. I was elsewhere in the house and was not paying much attention to what she was doing. Then I heard her yelling. She said she could not get the door open. I went upstairs to see what was wrong. When I entered the bedroom, she was hanging from the first door, pulling on it with her weight. It looked ridiculous at first, but only because there was no obvious reason for the door to be stuck. It was not locked. There was no heavy object behind it. It was supposed to swing open normally. My sister had already tried the handle and pulled hard enough that she was nearly lifting herself from the floor, but the door would not move. It was winter, so I could not easily blame heat or humidity for making the wood swell. The house was old enough that doors sometimes behaved strangely, but this one had never required that much force. I joined her. Together, we pulled until the door finally opened. I do not remember hearing anything break or release. It simply resisted us and then gave way. The small room between the doors was empty. Nothing had been pressing against the other side. There was enough space inside for perhaps 4 people to stand comfortably, so it was not as though the first door had been caught against the second one. My sister and I remained in the bedroom, looking into the little passage. The second door was several feet ahead of us. That was the one leading to the attic stairs. My sister still had the decorations with her, so I decided I would step forward and open it for her. I began to move. Before I touched the handle, it turned. I saw it happen. The handle rotated on its own. Then the second door opened. I stopped immediately. My hand was nowhere near it. I had not pushed the door, touched the knob, or even entered the space between the two doors. It opened inward smoothly, as though someone on the other side had turned the handle and pulled it. For a moment, I could not move. The door stood open, revealing the dark stairway leading into the attic. My sister was behind me, but from her position, she had not seen the handle turn or the door open by itself. She only saw me standing still. She did not understand why I had suddenly frozen. She moved forward and tried to push past me. As she did, the second door swung shut. It closed just as easily as it had opened. There was no resistance. It moved like it was gliding on freshly oiled hinges. That was when I started screaming. My reaction confused my sister. She thought the door had simply moved because of air pressure. In her mind, opening the first door had disturbed the old air trapped near the attic stairs. Perhaps a draft or vacuum had caused the second door to swing and then close again. That explanation made sense to her because she had not watched the handle rotate. She had not seen the door open before anyone touched it. From her perspective, I was frightened by a door swinging shut. From mine, something had turned the handle from the other side. I tried to explain what I had seen. The handle had moved first. The latch had released. The door had opened while I was standing several feet away. Then, it had closed the moment my sister stepped toward it. She did not seem convinced that anything unusual had happened. She still needed to put the decorations away, and she was not going to let my fear stop her. She opened the door, climbed the stairs, and carried everything into the attic. I waited below. I did not follow her. I expected her to shout that she had seen something, heard footsteps, or found someone hiding among the boxes. Nothing happened. She returned without injury. The attic was empty, or at least she did not notice anything unusual inside it. That should have made me feel better. If someone had been on the stairs, my sister would have encountered them. If an animal had pushed against the door, she might have seen it. If something dangerous had been waiting above us, it had apparently disappeared. Instead, her safe return only made the event harder to explain. Later, I spoke to my stepfather. The conversation eventually came around to the attic and the door. He jokingly told me that someone had died in the house. It was exactly the kind of information I did not want to hear after watching a door open by itself. He did not present it like a serious warning. He seemed amused by my fear and may have said it only to make the story more dramatic. I do not know how much detail he actually knew. He did not tell me where in the house the person died, when it happened, or whether the death had anything to do with the attic. Still, once he said it, I could not remove the idea from my mind. An old house, an unused bedroom, an attic entrance, a door that resisted two people, and another that seemed to open from the inside. Then the suggestion that someone had died there. Those details fit together too easily. There are ordinary explanations for almost everything that happened. The first door may have been stuck because of the frame. Winter does not completely eliminate changes in wood. Cold temperatures and dry indoor heat can cause wood, hinges, paint, and frames to shift in different ways. A door can bind when the house settles, when the latch catches at an angle, or when layers of paint create friction. A loose hinge can make the door sag enough for the edge to scrape against the frame. The pressure from my sister pulling may have made it worse until both of us changed the angle and released it. The door might also have been affected by pressure differences between the bedroom, the enclosed space, and the attic. Attics often contain colder air than the rest of the house during winter. Warm air from inside rises, while cold air enters through gaps in the roof or vents. Opening one door can change the airflow between those spaces. If the second door was poorly balanced, the pressure could cause it to move. That could explain why it opened and later swung shut. The house may have had a strong stack effect, where warm indoor air rises toward the attic and pulls colder air through lower openings. When the first door finally opened, a change in pressure may have pulled the second door. My sister's explanation about old attic air was not entirely unreasonable. The problem is the handle. A draft can move a door if the latch is not properly engaged. It can swing something that is already slightly open. It cannot normally rotate a secured handle and retract a working latch. But perhaps the latch was not fully closed. The handle may have appeared to turn because the door shifted under pressure. If the latch sat loosely inside the strike plate, the door could move just enough to rotate the hardware. An old handle can sag or twist when the latch releases. From several feet away, I may have interpreted a small mechanical movement as the knob turning deliberately. Fear can make movements appear more purposeful than they are. I had already watched my sister's struggle with the first door. The situation felt wrong before the second one moved. I was expecting resistance or another problem. When the handle shifted, my mind may have immediately interpreted it as someone opening the door. The door could have been under tension. Once the first entrance opened, air pressure pulled against the second door. The latch slipped from the frame. The handle moved slightly, and the door swung open. Then my sister's movement changed the airflow or disturbed the floor enough for it to close. That would produce the exact sequence without anyone being on the attic stairs. The hinges may also have been set at an angle. A door can appear to open or close on its own if the frame is not level. Gravity slowly pulls it toward the lowest point. If the first door had been stuck and then suddenly opened, the force could have shaken the wall or floor. That vibration may have released the second door. It opened because the frame leaned one direction. Then another vibration, movement, or change in pressure caused it to swing back. The smooth movement would fit well-maintained or loose hinges. What felt like something deliberately opening and closing the door may have been a badly aligned frame reacting to several forces at once. There could also have been an animal in the attic. Mice, squirrels, raccoons, birds, or even a cat could enter through roof gaps. A larger animal might press against the door from the stairway side. It could turn or disturb a loose handle if the mechanism was already failing. When the door opened, the animal might retreat upward before my sister entered. However, an animal large enough to operate a handle would probably make noise. We might hear scratching, movement on the stairs, or something shifting among the stored items. My sister did not report seeing anything. The attic may have been too large or cluttered for her to notice a hiding animal, but there was no clear evidence of one. Another person hiding in the attic is possible in theory, but extremely unlikely. Someone would have needed to enter without the family noticing, remain upstairs, open the door at exactly the moment I approached, and then hide while my sister carried decorations into the attic. They would also need to leave later without being discovered. There was no sign of forced entry, missing property, food, bedding, or regular occupation. The second door did not reveal a person standing behind it. A real intruder would have little reason to announce their presence by opening the door. The most likely explanation remains mechanical. Still, the timing is what frightened me. The door did not drift open while nobody was nearby. It waited until I stepped toward it. The handle moved at the moment I intended to reach for it. It opened as though meeting me halfway. Then, when my sister moved me aside and approached, it closed. That sequence felt responsive. It seemed aware of where we were. Human beings naturally see intention in movement. When an object reacts at the exact moment we act, the brain connects the two. I stepped forward, so something opened the door. My sister stepped forward, so something closed it. But timing alone does not prove awareness. The same movements that brought us closer to the door could have shaken the floor or altered the air. Our actions may have caused the door to move physically, even though we did not touch it. The event felt like a response, because cause and effect happened almost together. My sister's lack of fear is also important. She did not see the beginning. She missed the handle turning. Once she entered the attic and found nothing, she had little reason to treat the experience as paranormal. From her viewpoint, one stuck door and one freely swinging door were ordinary problems in an old house. Her explanation may have been more accurate because she was less frightened. On the other hand, she did not see what I saw. Her calmness cannot erase the movement of the handle. We experience different parts of the event. That is often how strange incidents remain unresolved. One person sees the critical detail. Another person arrives a second too late. Both are honest. One becomes convinced something impossible occurred, while the other sees only a normal object, behaving strangely. My stepfather's comment complicated everything. If he had never mentioned a death, I might eventually have accepted the airflow explanation and forgotten the incident. Once I heard that someone had died in the house, the door became connected to a possible presence. But people have died in many older homes. That fact alone does not make a house haunted. A death may have occurred peacefully after illness or old age. It may have happened in a completely different room decades earlier. The person may have had no connection to the attic. Without details, the statement provides atmosphere. rather than evidence. My stepfather may also have been joking without knowing whether the story was true. Adults sometimes tease younger family members by inventing dark histories about houses. He may have seen how frightened I was and decided to make it worse for his own amusement. If so, his comment should not be treated as confirmation of anything. Even if someone truly died there, connecting that person to the doors would be speculation. The supernatural explanation is that something occupied the attic or the small passage leading to it. The first door resisted because the presence did not want my sister to enter. When we forced it open, the second door opened on its own to reveal the stairway. Perhaps it was inviting us upward. Maybe it wanted to frighten me, but had no interest in harming my sister. When she approached confidently, the door shut. The death my stepfather mentioned could belong to whoever remained in the house. This interpretation gives the sequence intention. The presence controlled both doors. It resisted, opened, and closed according to our movements. But the behavior does not form a clear message. If it wanted to keep us out, why open the second door? If it wanted us inside, why close it when my sister approached? If it wanted to attack or communicate, why allow her to enter and return safely? The event seems meaningful, mainly because doors are associated with boundaries. Mechanically, they open and close. Spiritually, people interpret them as invitations, warnings, or passages. A badly fitted door can therefore feel like deliberate communication, even when it is only reacting to pressure. The attic itself adds fear. Attics are separated from normal living areas. They are dark, rarely visited, and filled with old possessions. Sounds from roofs, pipes, animals, and weather gather there. Because people do not spend enough time inside them to learn every normal noise, any movement feels unfamiliar. The narrow stairs and two-door entrance made ours feel especially isolated. Once the bedroom stopped being used regularly, the attic entrance became even more distant from daily life. That kind of space easily develops a reputation, even if nothing unusual happens. What I saw remains difficult for me to dismiss because I was standing still and watching directly. I did not hear the door move from another room. I did not discover it open later and wonder who touched it. I watched the handle turn. I watched the door open before my hand reached it. That directness gives the memory its strength. But direct eyewitness experiences can still be misinterpreted. A handle can move because of pressure on the latch. A door can open because the frame is tilted. A frightened observer can perceive mechanical movement as a deliberate action. The fact that something feels clear does not make every interpretation correct. The safest conclusion is that the door mechanism and airflow created a sequence that looked purposeful. The first door was probably binding against its frame. When it finally opened, the pressure change or vibration released the second door. A loose latch allowed the handle to rotate. The second door swung because of gravity or airflow, then closed when my sister moved through the space. That explanation accounts for the physical events without requiring a hidden person or presence. It is the explanation I would choose now. But it does not change how it felt at the time. I was standing in my stepsister's old bedroom, looking into the empty space between two doors. My sister had just needed my help to force the first one open. I stepped forward to reach the next handle. Before I touched it, it moved. The door opened toward the attic stairs. There was darkness beyond it. I stopped because every instinct told me someone had opened it from the other side. My sister tried to push past me. The door swung shut smoothly in front of her. She saw only the closing motion. I saw the invitation that came before it. She returned the decorations and came back unharmed. My stepfather later laughed and said someone had died in the house. Everyone else had a reason not to be frightened. The wood was old, the air pressure changed, the hinges were loose, the frame was uneven. All of those explanations are possible, but whenever I remember the incident, I return to the exact moment before the door opened. My hand had not reached the handle. My body was still. The handle turned anyway. It did not shake or slip. It moved as though a hand on the attic side had heard us struggling with the first door, waited for us to look forward, and decided to let us in.
We will get back to the next confession in a moment. If you are new here, subscribe to Dead Air Confessions for more real stories from people who experienced something they still cannot explain. Your support helps keep these late-night broadcasts alive. You can also leave a like and tell me which story has unsettled you the most so far. Now, let's return to the signal.
I was around 13 years old when this happened, and I think it was during summer vacation. It was very late at night, but I was still awake in my bedroom watching a movie on my laptop. During the summer, I was allowed to stay up later than usual, especially when there was no school the next morning. The rest of the house had already gone quiet, and my parents were asleep in their room. My bed was a loft bed, raised high above the floor on long legs. I had to use a ladder to climb into it. From up there, I could see most of my bedroom, including the door, the floor, and the entrance to a small closet or storage room. I liked being high above the ground. It made the bed feel separate from the rest of the room, almost like my own private space. That night, the laptop screen was probably the main source of light. The movie filled the room with changing colors, and the sound kept the silence from feeling too heavy. I was not normally afraid of the dark. I was not the bravest child in the world, but I could sleep without lights and move through the house at night if I needed to. Dark rooms made me cautious, but they did not usually terrify me. Then, in the middle of the movie, I felt something change. It began as an uneasy, tingling sensation. There was no clear reason for it. I had not seen movement in the room, and nothing had touched me. It was simply the sudden feeling that I needed to stop what I was doing and pay attention. I paused the movie. The sound cut off. The room became quiet. I looked around from the top of the loft bed, waiting to see whether anything moved. That was when I heard the breathing. It was slow and heavy. At first, I did not immediately assume it belonged to a person. Houses contain many sounds that can resemble breathing, especially late at night when everything else is silent. A fan can create a steady rise and fall. A washing machine can make rhythmic noises from another room. Pipes can hiss. Air moving through vents can sound like someone slowly inhaling and exhaling. I sat still and tried to identify it. The breathing continued. It did not sound mechanical. It sounded wet, strained, and human. Someone seemed to be breathing inside my bedroom. My heartbeat immediately began racing. I stayed on the bed and stared into every visible part of the room. The laptop screen gave enough light for me to see the larger shapes, but shadows filled the areas beneath furniture and around the storage room door. I looked toward the floor. There was no one standing beside the bed. Nothing moved near the bedroom door. I tried to tell myself that the sound came from somewhere else in the house. Maybe one of my parents was snoring. Perhaps their breathing was somehow traveling through the hallway. Maybe a television or appliance was still running in another room. But the sound felt too close. It did not seem to come through a wall. It felt as though it was directly beneath or beside me. The longer I listened, the harder it became to explain. I slowly began climbing down the ladder. Every movement felt loud. The bed frame shifted slightly beneath my weight. My hands touched the ladder one step at a time, and I tried not to make any sudden noise. Part of me did not want whoever was breathing to know that I had heard them. By the time my feet reached the floor, I was shaking. My heart was beating so hard that I could hear blood rushing in my ears. That made it difficult to tell whether the breathing was still there, but whenever I managed to focus, I thought I heard it again. Slow, heavy, close, I decided it might be coming from my parents' bedroom. Their room was down the hallway, so I opened my bedroom door and stepped outside. I stood there, listening. The hallway was dark and quiet. My parents' room was too far away. If one of them were breathing or snoring loudly enough for me to hear it clearly in my bedroom, I should also have heard it from the hallway. Instead, the sound became weaker or disappeared when I stepped outside. That suggested it had been coming from my room after all. My fear became much worse. I considered going directly to my parents and waking them. That would have been the sensible thing to do. But when you are 13, fear does not always lead to the most logical decision. I wanted to understand what was happening before I made a scene. I also worried that my parents would dismiss the sound or become annoyed if there was an ordinary explanation. I could already imagine them walking into the room, hearing nothing, and telling me to go back to sleep. I did not want to feel foolish. More than that, something inside me needed to know where the breathing came from. Today, I cannot believe I went back into the room. I was already terrified. My hands were trembling, and my body wanted to run in the opposite direction. Still, I returned and looked toward the closet or storage room. The breathing seemed to be coming from there. The storage space was attached to my bedroom. It was not a normal closet filled only with hanging clothes. It had shelves where we stored different objects and things we did not use every day. The door was closed. I approached it slowly. I could not tell whether the breathing became louder because I was closer or because my imagination was making it more intense. I reached for the handle. For a moment, I stood there without opening it. If someone was inside, opening the door would remove the only barrier between us. But if I left it closed, I would have to climb back into bed knowing something might be hiding a few feet away. I opened the door. Then, I turned on the light. At first, I saw nothing unusual. The shelves were filled with ordinary stored items. Boxes, bags, folded materials, and objects that had been placed there over time. There was no person standing on the floor. No one rushed toward me. For 1 second, I felt a small amount of relief. Then I remembered the higher shelves. Most of the storage room consisted of shelving, and the top shelf was above my normal line of sight. I looked up. There was something on it. At first, my mind registered the shape as a person. Then, it looked worse than a living person. It looked like a corpse. A body seemed to be lying or crouching on the highest shelf, staring directly down at me. Its face looked dead or close to death. It did not have the healthy appearance of someone hiding as a prank. It looked pale, sick, and lifeless. But it was breathing. The same slow, heavy breaths I had heard from the loft bed seemed to be coming from the figure. It remained on the shelf, looking at me. I cannot remember every detail of its face now, and I do not want to invent features that may have faded with time. What I remember most clearly is the overall impression. Something shaped like a human body was folded into a space where no person should have been able to rest comfortably. Its face was turned toward me. Its eyes appeared open. Its chest or body moved with difficult, heavy breathing. It looked dead and alive at the same time. I stumbled backward. My body collided with something in the room, knocking it over. I nearly fell. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. It was as though fear had closed my throat. I backed away from the storage room door and collapsed onto the floor. Then I began crying. I sat there shaking and weeping, unable to decide what to do. I did not run to my parents. I did not look up again. I did not close the door or switch off the light. I stayed on the floor, expecting the thing to climb down. I imagined hearing its weight shift on the shelf. I expected its hands to appear at the edge. I thought it might crawl out of the storage room and come toward me. But nothing happened. The heavy breathing may have stopped, or perhaps I could no longer hear it over my own crying and heartbeat. I do not know how long I remained there. It might have been only a few minutes. It felt much longer. Eventually, I began to realize that I was still alive. Nothing had grabbed me. Nothing had come out of the closet. The room was silent again. I did not have the courage to inspect the shelf a second time. Instead, I crawled back to the ladder and climbed into my loft bed. I pulled myself up as quickly as I could and stayed there. Being high above the floor felt safer than remaining near the closet, even though the top shelf was closer to the level of my bed than the floor had been. I shook and cried until exhaustion finally took over. At some point, I fell asleep. The next morning, daylight changed the room. Everything looked ordinary again. The closet contained the same shelves and stored objects it had always held. There was no corpse on the top shelf. There was no stranger hiding in the house. The windows had not been opened. The doors had not been forced. Nothing appeared to be missing. I told my parents what had happened. They said I had been dreaming. That was the simplest explanation. And in some ways, it was the only explanation that made sense. A dying or injured person could not realistically enter our house without anyone noticing, climb onto a high shelf inside my storage room, breathe loudly while staring at me, then leave before morning without making any noise or leaving evidence. The shelf was not designed to support a person. The entrance was not hidden from the rest of the house. There was no reasonable way for the figure to have been physically real. But I did not remember the experience as a dream. I remembered watching the movie. I remembered pausing it. I remembered climbing down the ladder. I remembered standing in the hallway. I remembered opening the storage room door and switching on the light. Most importantly, the object I had knocked over while stumbling backward was still on the floor in the morning. That detail made the explanation harder for me to accept. If I had dreamed everything, why had something in the room actually fallen? The most likely answer is that I was awake for part of the event, but not all of it. I may have experienced a vivid sleep-related hallucination. Even though I believed I had been watching a movie only moments earlier, I could have briefly fallen asleep without noticing. People do not always recognize the exact moment sleep begins, especially when they are tired and lying comfortably in bed. The movie could have continued playing while I drifted off. I may have dreamed that I paused it, heard breathing, climbed down, and opened the closet. At some point, I woke while already moving through the room. Another possibility is that I genuinely paused the movie and got out of bed, but I was still partly asleep. Sleep and wakefulness are not always completely separate states. A person can move, see their surroundings, and make decisions while dream imagery continues. This is especially possible during a confused awakening. My real bedroom may have become the setting for a waking dream. The shelves were real. The light was real. The object I knocked over was real. The corpse-like figure was not. That would explain why the environment matched reality and why there was physical evidence that I had been on the floor. I did not need to be sleepwalking through the entire house. I may only have experienced one isolated episode of partial wakefulness. Having no previous history of sleepwalking does not make one unusual night impossible. Sleepwalking and confusional arousals can happen once, especially during stress, exhaustion, illness, changes in sleep schedule, or adolescence. Summer vacation may have disrupted my normal routine. I was staying awake very late and watching a screen in bed. I may have been more tired than I realized. The breathing could have been a real sound incorporated into the hallucination. It may have come from a fan, appliance, pipe, neighbor, animal, or one of my parents. Once I became frightened, my brain interpreted the rhythm as human breathing. A normal mechanical sound can become extremely convincing when someone listens for a threat. Fans do not always create a perfectly steady hum. They speed up, slow down, vibrate, or push air against objects in ways that resemble inhaling and exhaling. A washing machine in another part of the house could create a slow cycle. Plumbing might produce a wet or strained noise. If the sound traveled differently depending on where I stood, it could seem louder in my room than in the hallway. The building's walls, floors, and furniture might have amplified it. The storage room could act like a resonating chamber. The shelves and hollow spaces may have made an ordinary vibration sound as though it came from inside. My fear then gave the sound a source. There is someone breathing in the closet. Once I opened the door and looked up, my mind found a shape that matched that expectation. The top shelf probably contained something. A pile of clothes, a bag, a blanket, a mannequin-like object, or several stored items may have formed the outline of a body. From below, shadows could create the appearance of a face. Two dark marks might look like eyes. A fold could resemble a mouth. A rounded object under fabric could look like a head. The movement I interpreted as breathing might have come from air circulating through the small room. Fabric could rise and fall slightly. A hanging bag might sway. Even the movement of my own body and eyes can make a stationary object appear to shift in low light. But I had turned on the storage room light. That is what makes the misperception harder to accept emotionally. I did not see this shape only in darkness. I remember seeing it under direct light. Still, fear can distort objects even when they are visible. The brain recognizes patterns before it analyzes details. When someone expects a human figure, a pile of unrelated objects can briefly become one. This is called pareidolia. People see faces in curtains, clothes, trees, shadows, and furniture. Usually, the illusion disappears after a closer look. But I never took a closer look. The moment the shape became a corpse in my mind, I stumbled backward and stopped inspecting it. I did not remain long enough for the visual interpretation to correct itself. The object stayed a corpse because I fled before it could become a box or pile of fabric again. My parents may have known exactly what was stored on the shelf, and therefore could not understand how I mistook it for a person. To them, the space contained harmless household items. To me, during a moment of extreme fear, those objects formed something human. I remember believing there was nothing on the shelf that could possibly resemble a body. That may be true, but memories of room arrangements change over time. The shelf may have held different objects on that particular night. Someone might have moved them later. A bag, coat, blanket, or old decoration could have been removed before I tried to reconstruct what I saw. Perhaps my parents checked the shelf the next morning and rearranged things without considering the importance. The visual conditions also mattered. Light from below can make ordinary shapes look unnatural. Shelves create deep shadows behind objects. A face-like shape, partly hidden near the ceiling, would appear pale in some areas and completely dark in others. From the floor, the perspective could stretch or compress the form. My frightened mind may have supplied the corpse-like details. The breathing sensation might also have continued after the sound itself stopped. When the heart is racing, the body produces many internal noises. I could hear my own breathing, pulse, and blood moving near my ears. Because I expected the figure to breathe, I assigned those sounds to it. Each time I inhaled, the corpse seemed to inhale. Each time my chest moved, its body appeared to move. The rhythm stayed connected, because it may have been my own. The fact that I could not scream also fits an intense fear response. People often imagine that they will immediately shout when they see something terrifying. In reality, the body may freeze. The throat tightens. The breath becomes shallow. The person can cry or shake, but cannot produce a loud sound. This does not require sleep paralysis. I was able to move, stumble, crawl, and climb the ladder. My body was not paralyzed. It was overwhelmed. The fallen object proves that I physically moved through the room, but it does not prove the figure was there. I knocked something down because I believed I saw a corpse. The fear and movement were real. The visual source may have been a hallucination or misidentified object. Another possibility is that I experienced a nightmare, followed by a false awakening. I could have dreamed that I heard breathing, climbed down, and saw the body. Then I may have partially awakened in panic, fallen or moved something in the bedroom, and climbed back into bed without fully understanding what was happening. In the morning, the knocked-over object became evidence that the entire dream had occurred physically. The two sequences merged into one memory. Dreams often recreate familiar rooms with surprising accuracy. The loft bed, ladder, hallway, storage door, shelves, and light switch would all be known to my brain. The dream could place me in the exact room and make me believe I was awake. Only the corpse would be impossible. When the terror caused a real physical awakening, I may have stumbled and knocked something over. The dream and waking movement became impossible to separate. There is also a chance I experienced a brief visual hallucination unrelated to sleep. Extreme fatigue, fever, migraine, stress, dehydration, or medication can sometimes produce vivid images. I do not remember being ill, but I may have been sleep-deprived. Staying awake late into the night during summer could create unusual perceptual effects. The visual system becomes less reliable when someone is exhausted. Shadows move. Peripheral shapes seem human. Sounds become difficult to locate. A tired brain may momentarily place a person where only objects exist. One isolated hallucination does not necessarily mean there was a serious medical problem, especially since it never happened again. If I had continued seeing figures while fully awake, hearing voices, or experiencing other symptoms, medical evaluation would have been important. But this remained a single nighttime event connected closely to sleep. That makes a sleep-related explanation much stronger. A real intruder is almost impossible, but it is worth considering because that was what I believed at the time. For someone to be on the shelf, they would need to enter the house without waking my parents. They would need to know the layout, reach my bedroom, open the storage space, and climb onto the highest shelf. They would have to remain there while breathing loudly enough for me to hear from the loft bed. Then, after I saw them and returned to bed, they would need to climb down, leave the room, and exit the house without making any detectable sound. Nothing was stolen. No locks were damaged. No footprints, clothing, blood, or other evidence remained. There was no reason for a sick or dying person to choose that shelf. A prank would also require someone with access to the house and a willingness to risk serious injury. No friend or family member admitted to it. The physical explanation is therefore extremely weak. An animal is possible only for the breathing. A cat, raccoon, or other creature might enter a storage space and make heavy sounds. But no ordinary animal could look like a full human corpse on the shelf unless hidden behind fabric or objects. A large animal would also leave signs. There would be scratching, droppings, damaged storage, or noise when it escaped. None was found. The supernatural explanation is that the figure was some kind of apparition. Perhaps it appeared only after I noticed the breathing. It may have been attached to the house, the room, or an object in storage. It chose the top shelf because that position placed it near the height of my loft bed. From there, it could breathe in the dark until I came looking. When I saw it, it did not attack. It simply stared. Then, by morning, it was gone. This interpretation fits the experience as I remember it, but there is no supporting evidence beyond my own perception. No one else saw the figure. The breathing never returned. The house did not develop a pattern of unexplained activity. There was no known death or history connected to the storage room, at least not one I was aware of. An apparition that appears once during a late night. Sleep-adjacent experience is much less likely than a hallucination or misperception. Still, what I saw changed me. Before that night, I was not truly afraid of closets. They were only small storage spaces. Afterward, every closet contained the possibility that something might be above eye level. Most people check the floor and corners when entering a dark room. I learned to look up. The loft bed also became less comforting. Being raised above the floor had once made me feel protected. After the incident, I realized I was closer to the top shelf than I had understood. If the figure had been real, it may have been almost level with me while I watched the movie. It could have been breathing only a short distance from my bed. That thought stayed with me. The darkness changed, too. I had never been especially afraid of it before. After that night, darkness no longer felt empty. It became something that could hide details until I got close enough to see them. The breathing could begin before the figure became visible. A normal room could change without anything entering it. I no longer trusted familiar shadows. My parents' explanation was probably correct. I was dreaming, hallucinating, or half asleep. They may have believed dismissing it quickly would help me calm down. Adults often tell frightened children it was only a dream, because they want the fear to end. But the word "only" does not match how such experiences feel. A dream can leave someone shaking on a real floor. A hallucination can make them knock over a real object. An imagined figure can permanently alter how they feel about a room. The cause may be internal, but the experience is still real to the person living through it. I did not invent the fear afterward. I did not decide to make the closet frightening. Something in my perception appeared on that shelf and stared at me while breathing. Whether it existed outside my brain is the part I cannot determine. The most likely reconstruction is that I was extremely tired and briefly fell asleep while watching the movie. I woke partially after hearing a normal household sound. Because I was not fully awake, the sound became heavy breathing. I climbed down and investigated while in a confused state. The shelves contained objects that formed a human-like shape. My half-dreaming brain transformed them into a corpse. I panicked, knocked something over, and eventually returned to bed. By morning, I was fully awake and unable to reproduce the illusion. That explanation accounts for the sound, the movement through the room, the fallen object, and the absence of any physical intruder. It is the explanation I would give to anyone else. But when I remember the night, I do not remember a pile of clothes that briefly looked strange. I remember a body. I remember its face turned toward me. I remember the deep, labored breaths. I remember the moment I switched on the light saw nothing at first, and then lifted my eyes toward the highest shelf. Something was waiting there. It had heard me moving through the room. It had listened while I stood in the hallway, trying to convince myself the breathing came from my parents. It remained silent except for the slow movement of air in and out of its body. I stumbled backward and knocked something down. I collapsed on the floor. Nothing came after me. That may be the strongest evidence that it was not real. A living intruder would move. An animal would escape. A dream figure could remain frozen because it existed only within my fear. But at 13, I did not know that. I only knew there was something above me that looked dead, but continued breathing. I cried until I was too exhausted to remain awake. In the morning, it was gone. The shelf held nothing that looked remotely human. My parents told me I had dreamed it. The object on the floor proved only that I had gotten out of bed, not that I had seen what I believed I saw. I understand that now. I know there is no reasonable way a dying stranger entered our home, climbed onto a shelf, stared at me, and disappeared before daylight. I know the brain can create vivid images near sleep. I know fear can turn objects into bodies and ordinary sounds into breathing, but knowing all of that has never completely changed the memory. I can still see the storage room light coming on. I can still see the empty shelves at eye level. Then I look higher. At the very top, folded into a space where no person should fit, something pale and corpse-like looks down at me. Its body barely moves. Its eyes remain fixed on mine. And from somewhere inside it comes the same slow, heavy breathing that had drawn me out of bed. The strongest detail is that the encounter did not leave you frightened. It left you furious enough to fight through the paralysis and swing at the figure. I'm keeping the lucid dream collapsing into your real bedroom, the violent sensation at your neck, and the shadow's strange reaction to something you could not hear at the center. I have experienced sleep paralysis before, but this was the only time I came out of it feeling more angry than afraid. I have always been a lucid dreamer. Most of the time, I know when I am dreaming, or I eventually become aware of it while the dream is still happening. Once that awareness begins, I can sometimes make decisions, change what I am doing, or at least observe the dream without completely accepting it as reality. This particular experience began inside one of those dreams. In the dream, it was nighttime, and I was getting ready to sleep. That may sound strange, falling asleep inside a dream, but it felt perfectly normal while it was happening. I lay down and settled into the bed. The room around me was dark. I tilted my head slightly to the right and took a slow, deep breath, preparing to close my eyes. Then something inside me reacted. It was not a sound or movement that I clearly noticed. It felt more like instinct, the sudden awareness that someone had entered the room without announcing themselves. Every part of me seemed to say the same thing. Look at the door. I did not turn my head completely. I looked toward it with my peripheral vision. A figure was standing there. It was shaped roughly like a person, but it was darker than the night around it. The room itself was already almost completely black, yet the outline of the figure remained perfectly visible because it seemed to contain an even deeper darkness. It was not simply a person standing in shadow. The figure was the shadow. Its body was slouched forward. Its shoulders were drawn inward, and its posture looked uncertain, almost cautious. That hesitation was one of the strangest parts. It did not immediately rush toward me like a monster in a nightmare. It stood near the doorway as though it was deciding whether to approach. Its body language suggested that it knew I was there, but it was not sure whether I had noticed it. I remained still. At first, I was still operating under the logic of the dream. I watched it and waited to see what it would do. The figure made a small, uncertain movement. Then it crossed the room so quickly that I could not follow the motion. One moment, it was at the doorway. The next, it was on top of me. There was no visible rush across the floor, no footsteps, no gradual approach. It practically teleported from the entrance to the bed. Before I could react, it leaned over me and opened its mouth. A long, round tongue unfolded from it. The tongue reminded me of the one Venom has in the comics and films, except this one seemed even more unnatural because there was no clear face around it. It extended for perhaps 2 feet, impossibly long in comparison with the vague shape of the head. The cautious behavior disappeared immediately. The figure lowered itself toward the left side of my neck and began licking me. It was not slow or curious. The movement was frantic and violent. Its head twitched, while the tongue moved rapidly against my neck. The motion was so fast and aggressive that it felt less like an animal tasting something and more like an attack meant to disgust or humiliate me. I could feel it. The sensation against my skin was vivid. The tongue moved repeatedly over the same part of my neck while the figure pressed close to me. For the first few moments, I willingly remained still. I was watching. Part of me was still aware that this might be a dream, and I wanted to understand what was happening before I acted. The figure seemed confident now. Whatever uncertainty it had shown at the doorway was gone. It behaved as though my stillness meant I could not stop it. That was when I decided to retaliate. I tried to move. Nothing happened. The moment I attempted to raise my arm, I understood the position I was actually in. I was paralyzed. The dream began to collapse around me. The imagined room faded, and my real bedroom slowly came into view. The walls became familiar. The bed beneath me felt real. The darkness shifted into the actual shadows of my home. But the figure did not disappear with the dream. It remained on top of me. For a brief period, I was awake enough to recognize my real bedroom, but still unable to move. The shadow figure existed within that real space, leaning over me exactly where it had been in the dream. We looked at each other. I could not see its eyes. There were no visible features at all. Still, the sensation of eye contact was unmistakable. It knew I was looking directly at it, and I knew it was looking back. Most descriptions of sleep paralysis focus on fear. People wake unable to move and feel terrified because something seems to be standing in the room, sitting on their chest, or watching from a dark corner. That was not the emotion I felt. I was furious. The figure had not merely frightened me. It had climbed on top of me and violated my space while I was unable to defend myself. It had used the exact moment when my body was weakest. The experience felt insulting, like someone had walked up to me and spat directly in my face. My anger rose faster than fear could take hold. I remember thinking, how dare you? You know this is when I am weakest. I wanted to grab it. I wanted to pull it closer and force it to explain what it was doing. I had no idea what questions I would ask if I actually caught it. I only knew that I wanted to reassert control. I refused to remain beneath it. I began fighting against the paralysis. At first, my entire body was unresponsive. My arms, legs, shoulders, and neck felt disconnected from my intentions. I focused everything on my left hand. I tried to move one finger, then the wrist, then the arm. The figure remained close, but its attention seemed to shift. Suddenly, it paused. Its body became completely still. Then it turned its head away from me. The motion looked like a person reacting to a noise from somewhere else in the room. It seemed to hear something. I heard nothing. I lived alone at the time, so there should not have been another person in the home. No one was standing in the hallway. No one was approaching the bedroom to interrupt what was happening. But the figure reacted as though something had called its attention away. That pause gave me the moment I needed. Control began returning to my left arm. I pulled it back and swung. I threw a left hook directly at the figure's head. The instant I moved, it disappeared. It did not retreat toward the door. It did not dissolve slowly. It blinked out of existence just before my fist reached it, as though it had avoided the punch deliberately. My arm completed the swing through empty air. At the same moment, the paralysis ended completely. I could move again. The room was empty. I sat up and checked the time. It was around 4 in the morning. I was fully awake, filled with adrenaline, and still extremely angry. I did not stay in bed trying to calm down. I got up and searched the house. I checked every room and every shadow. I looked behind doors, around corners, and into the darker areas where a person or figure might be hiding. I was not cautiously investigating because I was afraid of finding it. I wanted to find it. At that moment, I genuinely intended to grab the thing and rip its tongue out. Of course, there was nothing there. The doors were secure. The rooms were empty. No one had entered the house. The shadow figure was gone. Once the anger faded, the experience became harder to understand. The most likely explanation is that I moved directly from a lucid dream into sleep paralysis. The first part happened while I was fully dreaming. I lay down inside the dream, noticed the figure near the door, and watched it approach. Then my awareness began returning before my body had fully awakened. The dream environment faded, but the figure remained as a hallucination inside my real bedroom. That transition would explain why the encounter felt continuous. There was no clear moment when the dream ended and waking life began. One room melted into the other while the same figure stayed in front of me. Sleep paralysis happens when awareness returns while the body is still in a stage of sleep that limits voluntary movement. The paralysis itself is normal during dreaming because it prevents people from physically acting out everything they do in their dreams. Sometimes the brain wakes before that physical restriction has ended. The person can see the actual room and understand where they are, but they cannot move. Dream imagery may continue during that overlap. A figure from a dream can therefore appear to remain in the bedroom after the rest of the dream disappears. This fits my experience almost perfectly. The shadow figure began as part of the lucid dream. When I partially woke, the brain placed it inside the real room. The sensation against my neck could also have had a physical cause. My pillow, blanket, shirt collar, hair, or the position of my head may have created a repeated sensation on the skin. A small draft could have moved something against my neck. Sweat might have cooled or shifted across the area. Because I was dreaming, my mind interpreted that sensation as a tongue. Once the figure appeared, the brain connected the physical feeling to its actions. Something is touching my neck. The shadow figure is leaning over me. Therefore, the figure must be licking me. The frantic twitching movement may have matched my pulse, muscle activity, or irregular sensations created while waking. The tongue itself could have come from familiar horror imagery. I compared it to Venom because that is the closest visual reference I have. The brain often uses images from films, comics, games, and stories to create threatening dream figures. A featureless shadow is difficult to understand, so the dream gave it one exaggerated feature. A mouth, a long tongue, something capable of violating personal space without needing hands or a visible face. The fact that I am a lucid dreamer may have influenced my reaction. I was accustomed to recognizing dreams and sometimes taking control of them. When the paralysis prevented me from acting, I did not accept the helplessness. Instead of viewing the figure as all-powerful, I viewed it as something taking advantage of a temporary physical weakness. That produced anger. The thought was not, This creature can kill me. It was, you waited until I could not move. That made the encounter feel unfair rather than unbeatable. Anger may have helped me break the paralysis. Strong emotional effort, repeated attempts to move a finger or hand, and the natural end of the sleep stage probably occurred at the same time. My left hand began responding. I swung. By then, my brain had fully awakened, so the hallucination disappeared. From my perspective, the figure vanished to avoid the punch. From a neurological perspective, the return of movement and disappearance of the image happened together because both were signs that I was fully awake. The figure's reaction to an unheard sound is more difficult to explain emotionally, but it still fits dream logic. My brain may have been preparing to end the hallucination. The figure turned away because the scene was losing stability. Perhaps a real sound occurred somewhere outside my conscious awareness. A vehicle passed. A pipe shifted. A neighbor moved. An appliance turned on. My dreaming brain registered the sound but did not allow me to hear it clearly. Instead, it made the figure respond. The shadow turned toward the source. That reaction may have been the dream's way of acknowledging the sound. It is also possible that the change came from within my own body. My arm was beginning to move. My breathing changed. My heart was pounding. The figure seemed to hear something because my brain recognized that the paralysis was ending. Its hesitation created a final moment of tension before the hallucination disappeared. The behavior at the doorway may have worked in the same way. The figure seemed uncertain because part of me already knew I was dreaming. It approached cautiously, testing whether I would become aware. Once it realized I was still lying there, it moved. That interpretation gives the figure intelligence, but the intelligence may have been my own. Dream characters often behave as though they know things the dreamer has not consciously admitted. The shadow's caution could represent my own uncertainty. Am I asleep? Am I awake? Is something at the door? The moment I accepted the figure as real, it attacked. Then, when I began regaining control, it became cautious again. In that sense, the figure's behavior followed my mental state. It was confident while I was paralyzed and hesitant when I started waking. That makes sense if it was created by my brain. The hallucination existed only while the paralysis supported it. As soon as I could physically challenge it, the image could no longer remain. Still, the event felt far more personal than an ordinary nightmare. It did not feel random. The figure watched me from the door. It hesitated. It chose to approach. It crossed the room instantly. It touched a vulnerable part of my body. Then, it looked directly at me when the dream faded. Finally, it reacted to something and disappeared just before I hit it. That sequence made it feel like a conscious being with its own decisions. The supernatural explanation is that the figure was an entity capable of entering dreams or appearing during sleep paralysis. Perhaps lucid dreaming made me more aware of it than most people would be. Instead of creating the figure, my dreaming state allowed me to see something that was already present. It remained when the dream faded because it was not part of the dream. It used the paralysis because it knew I could not physically resist. My thought, this is when I am weakest, would then be literally true. The figure's reaction to an unheard sound could suggest that something else entered the room or interrupted it. Maybe it heard a presence I could not perceive. Perhaps something protective approached. The entity turned its head because it realized it was no longer alone. That distraction allowed me to move. This interpretation would explain why it stopped suddenly, even though I lived alone. But there is no physical evidence for it. Nothing was disturbed. There were no marks on my neck that I remember. No one else witnessed the figure. It appeared during a known sleep-related condition and vanished at the exact moment the paralysis ended. All of those details strongly favor a hallucination. The fact that the event felt intelligent does not prove the figure existed independently. Dreams create intelligent characters all the time. They speak, react, hide information, and appear to have intentions. The person dreaming may even feel surprised by what they do. The brain can create both sides of an interaction without the conscious mind knowing what will happen next. A lucid dream does not mean complete control. The dreamer may understand that the environment is unreal while still being unable to control every figure inside it. That may be what happened to me. I knew enough to observe the shadow, but not enough to stop its approach. Then I woke into paralysis and briefly lost even the freedom I had inside the dream. The experience reversed the usual advantage of lucid dreaming. Normally, awareness gives me control. That night, awareness arrived while my body was still locked. I knew what was happening, but could not act. The figures seemed to take advantage of that gap. My anger may also have protected me from the panic people normally feel. Fear often makes a person feel smaller and more helpless. Anger creates the urge to move toward the threat. Even though my body was paralyzed, my mind was already attacking. I was not begging the figure to leave. I was waiting for enough control to grab it. The left hook became the physical expression of all that rage. The fact that I actually swung once movement returned made the scene feel less like passive sleep paralysis and more like a confrontation. For me, the encounter did not end because the figure chose to leave. It ended because I fought back. That is probably not what happened scientifically, but it is how the memory feels. The paralysis released naturally. The hallucination ended. My arm moved. Because those events happened almost simultaneously, my mind arranged them into a clear cause. I swung, and it vanished. Or perhaps it saw the punch coming and moved first. I cannot prove either interpretation. Searching the house afterward was unnecessary, but I understand why I did it. My body was filled with adrenaline. The threat had felt physical. Simply turning on a light and telling myself it was a dream would not have satisfied that reaction. I needed to confirm that nothing was hiding nearby. I checked the home like someone searching for an intruder. Every dark corner became a possible place for the figure to reappear. The difference was that I wanted the confrontation. The anger had not yet given way to uncertainty. Only after I found every room empty did I begin considering the ordinary explanation. It was 4 in the morning. I had been asleep. I experienced a lucid dream, followed by paralysis and a hallucination. The entire event probably lasted much less time than it seemed. No entity entered my house. No creature climbed onto my bed. Nothing with a 2-foot tongue touched my neck. My brain created the figure, the sensation, and the confrontation during the unstable transition from dreaming to waking. That is the answer I believe most strongly. But one part still stays with me. The figure stopped before I moved. It turned its head as though it heard something. At the time, I lived alone. There was no one in the house to interrupt it. I heard no footsteps, voice, or door. Whatever caught its attention was outside my awareness. Perhaps it was only a real sound entering the dream. Perhaps it sensed that my body was waking. Perhaps that movement was simply part of the final hallucination. Those are all reasonable possibilities. Still, when I remember it, I see the pause clearly. The tongue stops. The frantic twitching ends. The figure lifts its head from my neck. It turns toward an empty part of the room as though something unseen has spoken. My left hand begins to respond. I pull back my arm. It looks away for 1 second too long. I swing. The figure disappears before my fist reaches it. Then I am sitting alone in my real bedroom at 4 in the morning, furious enough to search the entire house. There is nothing behind the doors, nothing in the hallway, nothing hiding inside the shadows. Maybe I am simply prone to vivid sleep paralysis because I spend so much time close to the border between lucid dreams and waking. Maybe my brain created a creature that behaved intelligently enough to feel independent. That explanation makes sense. But the experience left me with one strange thought. If the shadow was only part of my mind, then whatever caused it to turn away was part of my mind too. Some part of me decided that it had heard something approaching. Some part of me knew the encounter was about to end before I did. And some part of me gave the thing just enough hesitation for me to throw the first punch. A few years ago, a group of friends and I bought a Ouija board and decided to use it in the graveyard of a church in our town. Even writing that now makes me cringe. At the time, we thought it would be exciting. We were curious, young, and looking for something frightening to do. A graveyard seemed like the most dramatic place possible. Now I understand how disrespectful it was. Those graves belonged to real people. Families had buried loved ones there, and the churchyard was supposed to be a peaceful place. We treated it like a setting for a horror movie. I would not do it again. Before we went, one of my friends became extremely concerned about me. He was very religious and wanted nothing to do with the Ouija board. He believed that using it, especially in a graveyard, could invite something dangerous. He owned a set of rosary beads that he had kept for years. They were made from rose quartz and were genuinely beautiful. The beads had a soft pink color and looked more valuable than an ordinary plastic rosary. The necklace meant a lot to him. He practically forced me to take it. He told me to wear it around my neck while we used the board because it would protect me. I do not remember whether I believed him. I probably did not take the spiritual danger as seriously as he did, but his concern made me slightly nervous. He was not joking when he handed me the rosary. He made me promise to keep it around my neck. He also told me repeatedly to keep it safe. Most importantly, he said, please don't lose them. That warning stayed in my head because of how serious he sounded. He had owned those beads for years. They were not something he would casually give away or replace. I promised I would look after them. When the time came to go to the graveyard, most of the group changed their minds. It is easy to talk bravely when everyone is standing together in a well-lit room. It becomes different when it is dark outside and you are actually expected to enter a cemetery carrying a Ouija board. In the end, only one of my friends still wanted to go through with it. So the two of us went alone. We waited until it was dark. The graveyard was quiet when we arrived. The church stood nearby, and the graves stretched into the darkness around us. Headstones that would have looked ordinary during the day became black shapes against the ground. There were probably normal nighttime sounds around us. Wind moving through trees, insects, distant traffic, and perhaps animals in the grass, but everything felt more noticeable because of where we were. We found a place to sit and set up the board. The rose quartz rosary remained around my neck. I could feel its slight weight against my chest as we placed our hands on the planchette. We went through the process the way we thought we were supposed to. We asked whether anyone was there. We waited. Nothing happened. We asked more questions. We may have asked for names or signs, or whether anyone buried nearby wanted to speak with us. The planchette did not move. There were no strange voices. No footsteps approached. No cold hand touched either of us. Nothing appeared between the headstones. The whole experience was completely uneventful. We had expected at least some small movement from the planchette. even if it came from one of us unconsciously pushing it. Instead, the board remained still. After a while, disappointment replaced fear. We looked at each other and probably felt slightly foolish. We had entered a graveyard at night, brought a supposedly dangerous board with us, and frightened ourselves for no reason. Nothing wanted to communicate. Nothing seemed interested in us. Eventually, we stopped. We folded or packed away the board and began standing up. That was when the rosary came apart. There was no slow loosening. I did not notice the necklace catching on my clothes. I did not feel a sharp pull against my neck. There was no moment when I thought the chain or string had snapped. The beads simply sprayed in every direction. 1 second, the rosary was around my neck. The next, rose quartz beads were scattering through the grass and across the ground around us. It looked as though something had ripped the necklace away with force. But I did not feel anything grab it. That was the part that disturbed me most. If the rosary had caught on my jacket, hair, or the edge of the board, I should have felt pressure against my neck. If the string had slowly broken under the weight of the beads, they might have fallen almost straight down. Instead, they seemed to explode outward. At the same moment, I felt freezing cold. It was a sudden, unnatural chill. Perhaps the temperature had simply dropped, or the shock caused my body to react. But in that moment, it felt connected to the beads. Nothing had happened while we were asking questions. The board had remained silent. Only after we gave up and stood to leave did the object meant to protect me suddenly come apart. We froze and stared at the beads scattered around the graveyard. The disappointment from a few seconds earlier disappeared immediately. The silence no longer felt empty. It felt as though something had waited until we believed the experience was over. I reached toward my neck. The rosary was gone. I tried to understand how it had broken. I expected to find a snapped thread hanging from my collar or a broken clasp, but I did not clearly see a damaged necklace. The beads were simply everywhere. In the darkness, it was difficult to find them all. Rose quartz is pale, but graveyard grass, soil, leaves, and shadows made the small pieces easy to lose. We searched, but I do not remember recovering every bead. My friend's warning kept repeating in my mind, "Keep them safe. Please do not lose them." And there I was, in a graveyard at night, watching the beads he had owned for years disappear into the ground. The whole thing frightened me, but it also filled me with guilt. The rosary had not belonged to me. My friend had trusted me with it because he was genuinely afraid something might happen. Now the necklace was destroyed. When I told him, he was furious. I could not blame him. From his perspective, he had handed me something beautiful and personally meaningful, told me repeatedly not to damage it, and I brought it back broken, or incomplete. Even though he had warned me that the beads were supposed to protect me, he did not accept my explanation that they had somehow flown apart on their own. He believed I had broken them by accident. That was probably the most reasonable conclusion. He may have thought I caught them on my clothing while standing, pulled too hard, or damaged the string earlier without noticing. Perhaps I was embarrassed and turned an ordinary accident into a strange story. I understood why he did not believe me. But I know what the moment felt like. I did not feel the rosary snag. I did not feel it tighten around my throat. I did not touch it. The beads just burst away from me. The simplest explanation is that the thread holding the rosary together had weakened over time. My friend had owned it for years. Even if the beads looked well cared for, the material connecting them may have become brittle. Thread can fray. Elastic can dry out. Wire can bend repeatedly until it breaks. Knots can loosen. The weight of stone beads places constant strain on the necklace. Rose quartz is heavier than plastic. If the rosary had been worn frequently or stored in changing temperatures, the string could have been close to failure before I put it on. Moving around the cemetery, sitting on the ground, leaning over the board, and standing again may have provided the final stress. The necklace could have broken without much warning. If the cord was already stretched, it might snap suddenly rather than pulling against my neck long enough for me to notice. The outward movement of the beads could also have a physical explanation. When a tightly strung necklace breaks, tension is released. The beads do not always fall neatly downward. If the cord snaps while the wearer is moving, they can scatter. I was standing up at the moment. My shoulders, chest, and clothing were moving. The rosary could have slid across my shirt, caught briefly on a button or fold, and then released. The movement of my body may have thrown the beads farther than I realized. In darkness, the sudden scattering would look more violent. I may also have reacted instinctively. If I felt something break, I might have raised a hand or jerked backward without remembering the exact motion. That could send beads in several directions. Shock compresses memory. I remember the necklace intact, and then the beads everywhere, but there may have been a fraction of a second between those moments when the cord caught or pulled. My brain did not store it clearly because I was already nervous. The cold sensation could have been caused by adrenaline. Sudden fear changes blood flow and can produce chills, goosebumps, shaking, and a feeling of cold moving across the skin. The temperature in a graveyard after dark may genuinely have been low. We had been sitting still for some time, and I may not have noticed the cold until I stood. When the necklace broke, my body entered a fear response. That made the air feel freezing. The two events seemed connected because they happened together. The location also influenced how we interpreted the accident. If the same necklace had broken in my kitchen, I would have blamed an old string. I would have gathered the beads, apologized, and moved on. Because it happened in a graveyard after using a Ouija board, it immediately felt supernatural. The mind does not judge events in isolation. It uses context. We had entered the cemetery expecting something frightening. We had asked unseen things to communicate. My religious friend had warned that I needed protection. The board had produced nothing, but our attention remained focused on spirits, danger, and the dead. When the rosary broke, it seemed like an answer. Perhaps the board did not move because the protection had worked. Perhaps something could not reach us while the beads remained intact. Then, as we stood to leave, that protection was ripped away. That interpretation appeared almost automatically. There is another ordinary possibility. The rosary was damaged while we were using the board. I may have leaned forward and trapped part of it between my body and the edge of the board. The string could have been pulled, cut, or weakened without breaking completely. A rough surface, zipper, or button might have damaged it. When I stood, the remaining fibers failed. Because the actual damage occurred earlier, I felt no obvious snag at the moment the beads scattered. The necklace had already been cut almost through. Standing only completed the break. The clasp might also have opened rather than the string snapping. If the fastening came loose, the strand could slide rapidly around my neck. Depending on the rosary's construction, beads might then come off one end. I may not have found a broken piece because nothing had actually broken. A loose knot or open connector allowed the beads to escape. That would match my impression that the necklace didn't even seem to break. The darkness made it difficult to inspect the parts. I was frightened and trying to gather small stones from the ground. I may not have understood how the rosary was assembled or what part had failed. My friend, who knew the item better, probably saw ordinary damage afterward and concluded that I had caused it. His anger suggests the broken mechanism may not have looked mysterious to him. If he examined it and believed it had simply snapped, That supports an accidental explanation. However, he was not present when it happened. He saw only the result. He could not know whether I had felt a pull. Another possibility is that my companion broke it as a prank. While we were standing close together, they could have grabbed the rosary, cut the thread, or pulled it from behind. If they moved quickly, I might feel only the release rather than the hand. The purpose would be to frighten me after the Ouija session failed. A prank would explain the perfect timing. Nothing happened with the board, so my friend created one final scare. But I do not remember seeing them close enough to touch the necklace. A forceful pull would probably hurt my neck or make me turn immediately toward them. They would also risk damaging a valuable rosary that belonged to someone else. Unless they admitted it later, the prank would achieve little beyond destroying property. It seems possible, but not especially likely. We may also have caused the beads to scatter while packing the board. The necklace could have become caught between folded sections or beneath an object. When I stood or lifted the board, the rosary was pulled apart. Because my attention was on standing and carrying things, I did not notice the brief contact. The force came from the board, not from an unseen presence. Again, the movement may have happened too quickly for my memory to preserve. The supernatural explanation is that something responded to the Ouija session by attacking the rosary. Perhaps the board seemed inactive because the religious object was preventing communication. The presence could not move the planchette or approach us while I wore it. When we decided to leave, it made one final attempt and tore the protection apart. The beads flying in every direction would represent a deliberate act rather than material failure. The sudden cold would mark the presence entering the space around me. This interpretation makes the timing meaningful. My friend had said the rosary would protect me. The very thing meant to keep something away was the only object affected. Nothing happened to the board. Nothing touched my companion. Only the rosary broke. If someone already believed religious objects have spiritual power, the incident might feel like confirmation. The necklace either absorbed something or was destroyed because it stood in the way. Some people might interpret the break differently. They could say the rosary protected me by breaking. Perhaps it took the force of whatever approached. And the scattered beads represented the end of the danger. In that version, the object did not fail. It completed its purpose. That idea might sound comforting, but it is still speculation. There is no evidence that any presence was in the graveyard. The planchette never moved. We saw no figure. We heard no voice. Nothing followed us home. The only unusual event was an old necklace coming apart while being worn outside at night. A mechanical failure is far more likely. The board itself also deserves an ordinary explanation. Nothing happened because there was probably nothing to communicate with. Ouija boards usually move through the ideomotor effect, where people make small, unconscious motions without realizing it. With only two participants, both may have been trying too hard not to push. Our hands remained tense. We expected the other person or a spirit to move the planchette. Because neither of us relaxed enough for unconscious movement, it stayed still. The silence was not a sign that something was waiting. It was simply two people touching a piece of plastic or wood. The disappointment probably made the necklace incident more powerful. We had expected a frightening result and received nothing. Then, exactly as we stopped trying, something dramatic happened. It felt like delayed communication. But coincidences often seem deliberate when people are emotionally prepared for them. The necklace was under physical stress throughout the session. The moment we stood was the moment most likely to break it. The timing, therefore, may not have been random at all, but it was mechanical rather than supernatural. Sitting kept the necklace still. Standing made it move. The old cord failed. The most disturbing part remains the lack of sensation. I expected a broken necklace to pull against my skin. I expected to hear a snap or feel the strand tighten. Instead, the beads were simply gone from my neck and spreading across the ground. But small physical events can happen without clear sensation. The neck and shoulders were covered by clothing. The rosary may have rested loosely rather than tightly. If the string broke near the lower part of the necklace, no force would reach my neck. Gravity would pull the beads downward, while my upward movement sent them outward. The whole event might be over before the nervous system registered anything. I felt cold because I saw the result first and understood it second. Memory may also have made the scattering more dramatic. At the time, perhaps the beads fell in a wide circle around my feet. Years later, I remember them spraying everywhere. The phrase captures how shocking it felt, but not necessarily their exact speed or distance. They may have bounced on stones, hard soil, or grave markers, creating the impression of an explosion. Quartz beads are solid and can travel farther than soft plastic ones when they hit a hard surface. Several small bounces in different directions would look like forceful scattering. The graveyard ground may not have been entirely grass. There could have been gravel, paths, or stone around us. One falling strand could produce dozens of unpredictable movements. My guilt also strengthened the memory. I had promised not to lose the beads. When they scattered, every bead that disappeared into the darkness felt like a separate failure. The event seemed larger because I knew how angry my friend would be. Fear and guilt combined. I was not only worried about what might have broken the rosary. I was imagining the conversation where I had to explain that I had damaged something precious after being specifically warned not to. My friend's reaction later grounded the event. He did not treat it as proof of a spirit. Despite being the most religious and cautious person involved, he believed I had broken the rosary accidentally. That is significant. He had already warned me that the board might be dangerous. If anyone was prepared to interpret the broken beads as supernatural, it should have been him. Instead, he was angry about the physical object. Perhaps he knew the rosary had a weak thread. Maybe he had repaired it before. He could have understood how easily it might break, even if he blamed me for being careless. His response suggests the damage looked normal rather than impossible. At the same time, he did not witness the moment. His disbelief cannot fully explain what I experienced. I still remember the absence of any pull and the sudden freezing sensation. The event remains strange to me, even if I accept the ordinary explanation. What bothers me most now is how perfectly everything lined up. My friend placed the rosary around my neck and warned me to keep it safe. He said it would protect me. Two of us entered a graveyard after dark and asked for something to speak. Nothing responded. We eventually gave up, folded the board, and stood to leave. Only then did the protection come apart. If it had broken while I was walking to the cemetery, it would have been an unfortunate accident. If it had snapped while I put it on, we might never have gone. If it had broken the next morning, nobody would connect it to the board. It happened in the exact second that made it feel like a final answer. That does not mean it was won. The most likely explanation is that the old string had weakened and snapped when I stood. My clothing or the board may have caught it without me noticing. The stone beads scattered because of my movement and the hard ground. Adrenaline caused the sudden cold. The supernatural meaning came from the graveyard, the Ouija board, and my friend's warning. That is the explanation I trust. But when I remember the night, I do not begin with the board. Nothing happened with the board. I remember the moment after. The two of us look at each other, disappointed. We decide the whole thing was pointless. We fold the board and start to stand. The rose quartz rosary is still around my neck. Then, without pressure, pain, or warning, it is no longer there. Pink beads fly through the darkness and disappear among the graves. The air turns freezing. I reach for my neck and find nothing. There is no visible hand, no person behind me, no clear broken strand, only the sound of small quartz beads landing in different directions and the memory of my friend saying the one thing I had promised not to do. Please don't lose them. Maybe the necklace was old. Maybe it caught on my clothes. Maybe my movement caused the beads to scatter farther than they should have. I know those explanations make sense. But I still wonder why it waited until the exact moment we stopped asking whether anything was there.
The broadcast is ending, but some voices do not disappear when the radio goes quiet. Maybe one of tonight's confessions will stay with you. Maybe you will remember it the next time your phone rings at an odd hour, or when you hear something outside after midnight. Leave a comment with the story that got under your skin the most. Subscribe to Dead Air Confessions for more stories from the people who called in after something went wrong.